Father God, we just thank you for tonight. We thank you for this time that we have to open up your word. I'm so excited to get into Leviticus and all the blessings that you have for us here in this amazing book of laws, and how it can apply to us today and how we can understand you better through it. Father, would you just guide us as we study your word? In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
All right, so how'd you guys do this week with this book? It's hard, okay? So I just want to read you one thing that I underlined. You've read it too, so it shouldn't come as a surprise. It was, that's the prologue. It was on the first page of chapter 1, and it says, form conveys meaning. I don't know if you guys really picked up on that, or exactly like the meaning of what that should mean to us as we get into Leviticus, that form conveys meaning. I want you to sort of have that in your head, because we're going to talk a little bit about the form of Leviticus that they presented in here tonight. But as we watch this video on the overview of Leviticus, I want you to pay attention to how the Bible Project, the video that we're about to watch, how they show the form of Leviticus and what that might mean for us as we open it up. Sound good? Mm-hmm. All right, go ahead, Fred.
The book of Leviticus is the third book of the Bible, and it's set right after the exodus of the Israelites from their slavery, when God brought them to the foot of Mount Sinai and invited Israel into a covenant relationship. Now, they had quickly rebelled and broke that covenant, and God had wanted for his glorious presence to come and live right in the midst of Israel in the form of this tabernacle. But Israel's sin has damaged the relationship. So, at the end of the previous book, Exodus, Moses, as Israel's representative, could not even enter God's presence in the tent. The book of Leviticus opens by reminding us of this fundamental problem. It says, the Lord called to Moses from the tent. So the question is, how can Israel, in their sin and selfishness, be reconciled to this holy God? That's what this book is all about. How God is graciously providing a way for sinful, corrupt people to live in his holy presence. Now, let's pause for a second and explore this really important idea that God is holy. It's fundamental to understanding this book. The word holy means simply to be set apart or unique. And in the Bible, God is set apart from all other things because of his unique role as the creator of all, as the author of life itself. And so if God is holy, then the space around God is also holy. It's full of his goodness and his life and purity and justice. So, if Israel, who is unjust and sinful, wants to live in God's holy presence, they too need to become holy. Their sin has to be dealt with. Thus, the book of Leviticus. Now, the book has a really amazing symmetrical design. It explores the three main ways that God helps Israel to live in his presence. The outer sections are descriptions of the rituals Israel was to practice in God's holy presence. The next inner sections focus on the role of Israel's priests as mediators between God and Israel. And inside of that are two matching sections that focus on Israel's purity. And then right here at the center of the book, there's a key ritual, the Day of Atonement, that brings the whole book together. The book concludes with a short section where Moses calls on Israel to be faithful to this covenant. Let's dive into the book. The first section explores the 5 main types of ritual sacrifices that Israel was to perform. 2 of these were ways that an Israelite could say thank you to God by offering back to God these symbolic tokens of what God has first given them. 3 other sacrifices were different ways of saying sorry to God. So here an Israelite would offer up the lifeblood of an animal while confessing that their sin has created more evil and death in God's good world. But instead of destroying this person, God, of course, wants to forgive them. And so this animal symbolically dies in their place and atones, which means it covers for their sin. And so through these rituals, the Israelites were constantly being reminded of God's grace, but also of his justice and of the seriousness of their evil and its consequences. The second set of rituals lays out the 7 annual feasts of Israel. And each of these retold a different part of the story about how God redeemed them from slavery in Egypt and brought them through the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land. And by celebrating these feasts regularly, Israel would remember who they were and who God was to them. Now, the section's about Israel's priests. You have Aaron and his sons first ordained to enter into God's presence on behalf of Israel. And then in this matching section, we find the qualifications for being a priest. The priests were called to the highest level of moral integrity and ritual holiness because they represented the people before God, but then also represented God to the people. Now, we find out why the priest's holiness matters so much back here in this first section. Right after the family of Aaron was ordained, 2 of his sons waltzed right into God's presence and flagrantly violate the rules. And so they are consumed by God's holiness on the spot. It's a haunting reminder of the paradox of living in God's holy presence. Because it's pure goodness, but it becomes dangerous to those who rebel and insult God's holiness. And so it's important that Israel's priests become holy, and also that all of the people of Israel become holy, which is what the next intersections are all about. Chapters 11 through 15 are about the ritual purity required of all the Israelites, and chapters 18 through 20 are about the moral purity of the people. Here's what's underneath all of this purity and impurity language. Because God is holy, and he's set apart, the Israelites need to be in a state of holiness themselves when they enter into his presence. This was called being clean or pure. God's presence was off limits to anybody who was not in a holy state, and this was called being unclean or impure. Now, an Israelite could become impure in just a few ways: by contact with reproductive body fluids, by having a skin disease, by touching mold or fungus, or by touching a dead body. Now, for the Israelites, all of these were associated with mortality, with the loss of life, which gets us to the core symbol of all these ideas. You become impure when you're contaminated by touching death, so to speak. And death is the opposite of God's holiness, because God's essence is life. Now, this is really key. Simply being impure was not sinful or wrong. Touching these kinds of things was a normal part of everyday life. And impurity was a temporary state. It just lasted a week or two, and then it's over. What was wrong or sinful was to waltz into God's presence carrying these symbols of death and impurity on my body. Don't do that. Now, the last way of becoming impure was by eating certain animals. And the kosher food laws are found right here in this section. Now, there have been lots of theories about why certain animals were considered impure and off limits. To promote hygiene or to avoid cultural taboos, the text just isn't explicit. But the basic point of all of these chapters is really clear. All together, these work as an elaborate set of cultural symbols that remind Israel that God's holiness was to affect all areas of their lives. This corresponding section over here is about Israel's moral purity. The Israelites were called to live differently than the Canaanites. They were to care for the poor instead of overlooking them. They were to have a high level of sexual integrity, and they were to promote justice throughout their entire life. Now, here at the center of the book, we find a long description of one of Israel's annual feasts, the Day of Atonement. Odds are that not every Israelite's sin and rebellion would be covered through the individual sacrifices. And so once a year, the high priest would take 2 goats. One of these would become a purification offering and atone for the sins of the people. And the other was called the scapegoat. The priest would confess the sins of Israel and symbolically place them on this goat, and then it would be cast out into the wilderness. Again, this is a very powerful image of God's desire to remove sin and its consequences from his people, so that God can live with them in peace. The book concludes with Moses calling Israel to be faithful to all of the terms of the covenant. And he describes the blessings of peace and abundance that will result if Israel obeys all of these laws. He also warns them that if they're unfaithful and dishonor God's holiness, it will result in disaster and ultimately exile from the land promised to Abraham. Now, if you want to see how Leviticus fits into the big storyline, it's helpful to look at the first sentence of the next book of the Bible, Numbers. It begins, "The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent." So we can see that Moses is now able to enter God's presence on behalf of Israel. The book of Leviticus, it worked. So despite Israel's failure, God has provided a way for their sin to be covered so that God can live with sinful people in peace. And that's what the book of Leviticus is all about.
Okay, Fred, can we just leave it paused? Oh, with that last image up there, is that possible? because I can't draw all that.
So, by checking I don't
know about you guys, but I got more the first time.
I feel like we're listening to Jump Tracks.
With sinful people in peace. And that's what the book of
Okay, you can
Leviticus.
just pause it right there. Okay, so if form conveys meaning, then what is this form telling us about the book of Leviticus? And it's chiasm, right? It's chiastic. So if I was to, I wish I had like a laser pointer. You guys are just going to have to follow my fingers and go with me. So if I go from the top left over there to the top right where the ritual feasts on the left side of the top right there, that would be like A and A1. And then the priest ordained and the qualifications for priests would be B and B1. Your purity would be C and C1, and Day of Atonement in the middle at D. And then at the very end of this would be E, which is your, I would describe that as your conditionality of the covenant. So if I was going to write that, it would be, I just want to make sure you're tracking with me here. You would have your, oh, I'm ready, nothing's up there. You can take that down now. The ritual, what we're going to talk about tonight is going to be the sacrifices. Is that wrong? Sacrifices. Okay, and then opposite the sacrifices, A1 is going to be the feasts. And then in the middle, you have the B and B1, you have the C and C1, and then you have the D, which is the Day of Atonement. Why is that important? Why does chiasm matter?
The center is the point.
The center is the point. That's different from English writing. In English writing, we have a thesis statement at the beginning, and then we have a conclusion at the end, and the things that we're going to talk about. If you want to get the gist of an email, for example, you can read the first line and the last line, and in the middle, sometimes it matters, and sometimes it's just kind of an explanation of what's going on in the first and the last lines. That's not the case with Hebrew writing. What chiasm does is it points us to the most important thing by putting it at the center of something that builds up to it and then down from it. And so, if this chiasm right here, if I call this C, and then I want to look at the Torah as a whole, then I have a second chiasm, right? Where you have Genesis, Exodus, over here at C was Leviticus, and then Numbers and Deuteronomy. So if the Torah is a chiasm, shouldn't I expect to see mirroring stories in Exodus and Numbers and in Genesis and Deuteronomy? So like a mirroring story, for example, when Israel takes his family into Egypt, and then Deuteronomy retells the story of them coming out of Egypt right before they're about to go into Canaan. You have Israel right before he dies at the end of Genesis blessing the 12, his 12 children, what would be the tribes of Israel, and then Moses at the end of Deuteronomy blessing the 12 tribes of Israel. In Exodus, Moses strikes a rock to get water out of it. In Numbers, there's this parallel story where they don't have any water. God tells them to speak to the rock, and then he hits it again, right? It's these repetitious stories, even down to like God providing quail, happens in Exodus, it happens in Numbers. It's everything in the Torah sort of becomes parallel. And if Leviticus is at the center of the Torah, and the Day of Atonement is at the center of Leviticus, what you end up with is the central message of the Torah is the Day of Atonement, Leviticus chapter 16. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you guys who read chapter 1 this week, you're like, yeah, of course we already read this. Why are you talking about it? It's so important to really think about Leviticus, I think, in this way, is one of the most helpful things that we can do as we're getting ready to go into the book. So right now, we are at the beginning of Leviticus, and geographically speaking, where are we?
Sinai.
We're still at Mount Sinai. Okay, so where's God?
Well, at the top of the mountain.
I knew I would get you guys.
Top of Old.
Is he at the top of the mountain?
Oh, no, he's.
What happened in Exodus 40? He came, they finished building the tabernacle, and he came down. I knew I would get you guys with that. So he comes down and he fills the tabernacle. And where's Moses? Outside the tabernacle. All right, so what's that?
That's the tabernacle.
Yep, what's this piece at the front?
That's
Altar.
altar.
What's this piece?
The
basin.
basin where they wash.
Yep. Over here,
That's the lamps.
that's the lampstand. Right here,
The incense.
altar of incense. Over here,
Showbread.
table of showbread. And in here,
The Holy of Holies, the covenant, and the mercy seat.
yep, the Ark of the Covenant inside the Holy of Holies. And then the presence of God, the pillar of fire by night and cloud by day. Awesome. And here
Why don't you put
is
the,
Moses.
why don't you put up the curtain between, or did you?
He did. You see
Yeah,
that line?
that line.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just, it's, I'm a bad artist, that's why.
Go in there and draw all the little cherubim.
Yeah.
Some pomegranates.
Okay. So, cool. What was our problem in Genesis 3 that we're trying to find the solution for?
Man, separation from God.
Man separation from God, right? Man and God are separate. Why? Sin. And then what has to happen? They have to get back together. We're trying to find the way that they're going to get back together. And in that video, they mentioned it, and I meant to make a point of it while it was still up there. I totally forgot. What is, according to what we watched, do you remember what they said is the purpose of Leviticus? Their little subtitle there.
How to get back in God's space.
Yeah, exactly. So if someone were to ask you, what is Leviticus about? What do you think you would answer?
People can be reconciled to God.
Yeah, absolutely. What most people would say is like, oh, well, it's a book of laws. But it's so much more than that. It actually describes, like, Leviticus is God's plan for how to reconcile what was broken in Eden. Right? Are you with me? Okay, so, great. This is like one of my favorite things, what we're about to do. Okay, I forgot. I need to save that. We need to get a new one. And we're going to do some more drawing. Not really drawing. We're going to make like a graph. We have in Leviticus chapters 1 through 7, which we only read 1 through 5 this week. And next week is going to be a nice light week because we're only going to do chapters 6 and 7 of Leviticus. We're going to take our time through Leviticus. We're going to spend a lot of time on these big issues. Chapters 1 through 7 as a whole make up that top left section from the video, that A, the ritual sacrifices or ritual offerings of Israel. And there are going to be 5 offerings specifically that we're going to talk about in this section. The first one in Leviticus chapter 1 is called, I think I messed up, the burnt offering. Okay, what is the burnt offering? What is it for? What does it do? So, Leviticus chapter 1. We're going to do a lot of reading tonight because we're only covering 5 chapters. Everyone cool with that? So, Yahweh called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any of you brings an offering to Yahweh, you shall bring your offering of livestock from the herd or from the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer a male without blemish. Shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before Yahweh." Okay, so what is the purpose of the burnt offering? To be accepted before Yahweh. Okay. He shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him. Okay, so who's being accepted? The guy bringing the offering or the offering? Well, really both. What did the animal do wrong?
Nothing.
Nothing. Okay. Who wants to be accepted? The guy who did something wrong.
Yeah.
But the animal has to be accepted. The idea here is substitution. He's taking something innocent and putting it in the place of something guilty, right? And then verse 4 finishes, to make atonement for him. So you heard the phrase substitutionary atonement? This is where it comes from. The burnt offering is substitutionary atonement. Now, Charlie, I so appreciated your email today because I read it, well, not solely for this reason, it was great regardless of this, but I read it right after I made my notes for class tonight, and I was like, you stole my point. You straight up like read my notes and put it in an email and sent it out before the class. The fact that the person, like we have this sort of mental image, I'm not quite sure where it comes from, but we think that the person brings the animal and then the priests do their thing, right? But that's not really the case. The person brings the animal, and that person lays their head on the animal. And that person takes a knife and kills the animal. And that person butchers the animal. Now the priests take over at that point and start putting things on the altar. But here's the thing. If you can't take your own sin and say, this innocent thing is going to die by my hand because of my sin, then you can't be forgiven under this system. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. If you can't put the knife to the innocent thing, there is no forgiveness for you. Right? Okay. So that is both heavy, but also is just glaringly about Jesus.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's no way that we could interpret that any other way than to look at Jesus' words, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. You are putting the knife to Jesus. Okay. Substitutionary atonement. Then he shall kill the bull before Yahweh, and this is where Aaron's sons take over. And Aaron's sons, the priest, shall bring the blood and throw the blood against the sides of the altar that's at the entrance of the tent of meeting. He shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into pieces, and the sons of Aaron shall put fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. And Aaron's sons, the priest, shall arrange the pieces, the head and the fat, on the wood that's on the fire on the altar. But his entrails and his legs he will wash with water, and the priest shall burn all of it on the altar as a burnt offering, a food offering, with a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. Okay. Couple Hebrew words we need to learn real quick early on tonight, and I'm going to keep on coming back to them. You're going to be glad you know them by the end. This right here, a burnt offering. This is the Hebrew word olah. It literally means the thing that goes up, or the thing that ascends. Right? Okay, so, who shall ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who olahs to where God dwells? If you're looking at the burnt offering right here, the thing that ascends is the aroma of the animal, right? Okay. Oh, I hope you guys like this as much as I like this. Pleasing. If I was going to pronounce this word in Hebrew, it would be nichoach. You got to really get the throat in that one. Nichoach. What's that sound like? It comes from the same root word as Noah. It's Noach. It means to settle down, to stay settled, to rest, to repose, to await. It is the aroma isn't just like God smells it and likes it. It puts God at ease. Why would God need to be put at ease? So he doesn't kill the person who sinned against him.
Oh.
Right? So you are guilty. You deserve death. God needs to be put at ease. We spent a lot of time talking about Exodus 32, whether or not God changed his mind. But what's happening here is the same as what's happening there. God was put at ease. He's turned away from the wrath that you deserve because something Noah's him, puts him at rest, right? What is the thing that puts him to rest? It's the aroma, okay? The Hebrew word for aroma is reach. So, Noach, reach. Do you remember a Hebrew word that goes kind of like reach? Ruach. It's the Spirit of God that hovers over the surface of the water. So what is ascending? It's not just smoke from the altar, but it's the animal itself. The essence or the ruach of the animal is putting God at rest from the wrath that should be poured out on the sinner. Are you tracking with what the burnt offering accomplishes? So it is the thing that goes up and puts God at rest by its spirit instead of the sinners. Everyone good with that? The Noach Ruach, the pleasing aroma. Okay. And then, in verse 10, we're basically going to read the same thing, except this time instead of the cows, it's going to talk about if the offering is a sheep or a goat. He brings it a male without blemish. He kills it on the north side of the altar before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priests, throw the blood against the sides of the altar, and he cuts it in pieces with its head and its fat. The priest shall arrange them on the wood that's on the fire on the altar, but the entrails and the legs he shall wash with water, and the priest shall offer all of it and burn it on the altar. It is a burnt offering. It is an olah, a food offering with a noach ruach to Yahweh. Everyone good? All right. By the way, how much of the animals left? Everything was burned. That's not the case with every offering. That's going to be important. Specifically next week. But it's going to be important. Verse 14. If his offering is a burnt offering of birds, he brings it turtle doves or pigeons. And the priest shall bring it to the altar and wring off its head and burn it on the altar. Its blood shall be drained out on the altar. He shall remove its crop with its contents and cast it beside the altar on the east side in the place for ashes. He shall tear it open by its wings, but shall not sever it completely. Do you remember that story? Genesis chapter 15, right? He cuts the big animals in half and sets the halves opposite, but the two birds he breaks, but he doesn't break them in half. He sets them opposite each other. And the priest shall burn it on the altar on the wood that's on the fire. It is an olah, a food offering with a noach ruach to Yahweh.
Why doesn't the sinner kill the turtle doves? Why does the priest?
I don't know.
Okay.
Good question.
How many people were there that this had to be done for each person?
Yep.
So how many people at this time were the nation of Israel?
Wasn't it like 500,000 or 700,000 men, fighting men who came out of Egypt or something like that?
So,
Plus women and children.
so 700,000 animals?
All the time. The priests were always on their feet. They were always running the fire. They always had, okay. So I love this mental image. I don't have, I have closed the thing. Okay. Come on. Take that one. Close. Save. Save. All right, back to here. The tabernacle. So I imagine that basically 24/7, 365, there would have been a line of people, right? All waiting to offer the thing that they had brought to offer because of the sin that they had committed. So if I'm standing here with my cow, right? And you're standing here with your cow. Is it hard for me to think I'm better than you when we're standing in line with our sacrifices at the tabernacle? Right? It's a visual representation every day that I'm no better than the person next to me. This is something that has conveniently and beautifully been lost in the new covenant because we have Jesus, and when we're dwelling on and thinking about Jesus, I can't see myself any better than you. But when I fail to dwell on and think about and meditate on Jesus, I see myself as better than everyone around me, right? Don't we all? And so as Jesus is teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, and he's talking about meekness, and he's talking about being poor in the kingdom of God, I have this picture in my mind of I'm standing in line at the tabernacle with my cow. Because if that's me, if I'm putting myself in that situation where I'm about to have to go put the knife to an innocent thing for myself, for my own atonement, I can't think anything good about me. Right? Okay. So, I love that mental image. I know it doesn't directly answer your question, but I think it indirectly does.
Well, why I'm confused is with so many people and one high priest.
Mm-hmm.
how is the Day of Atonement a day?
Well, the Day of Atonement is a special sacrifice. It is all of these
On
other
behalf
sacrifices.
of everyone?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yes.
So that's how Jesus is the one sacrifice that covers.
Yeah, how Jesus fulfills the Day of Atonement. But he also, you see the fulfillment of these other sacrifices in Jesus as well. But the Day of Atonement was a special one day a year, not like the burnt offering and the other offerings we're going to study, which were going on all day, every day. Mhm.
And all the priests could do those.
All the priests could do the sacrifices. It wasn't just the high priest like the Day of Atonement is. Yeah. So that's the burnt offering.
Did I read somewhere that the head of the household does an offering for his family? Or is that just for the atonement? I thought I read that.
Job did. Job sacrificed for his kids Passover. There's one sacrifice for the whole household.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know right now.
It would be a lot easier if it was just every household as
Yeah,
opposed
right.
to, you know, a 10-year-old kid bringing his own
Yeah, and bring his own every time.
and having to butcher it, so.
And here's the other thing I think about too. If I'm standing there waiting in line, I'm going to get probably pretty impatient and possibly like even act in anger and sin in the line where I'm waiting to go make atonement for sin, right? That's just, I don't know, I think about these things.
I don't see like how often or even on a day of the year
Right.
would be. So it's probably as they felt led to do so, right?
So this one in particular, and this is what I was about to actually say, so that's a great, thank you for leading me into the next point. The burnt offering, what does the burnt offering accomplish for the person making the sacrifice? Acceptance, and also, I'm going to say atonement, but acceptance is definitely in there as well. What do you need atonement for?
Your sin?
Your sin. So when would you make a burnt offering? When you have done something that you need to get forgiveness for. So the purpose of the burnt offering is to atone for sin, right? So how often are you sinning?
Every day.
Like every 11 minutes approximately, right? So you're constantly going to be making this burnt offering. If you're really doing it how you're supposed to be doing it, you're basically going to be bringing a bull to the tent and then going home and getting another one, right? And bringing it back to the tent. And I think that the idea behind this, well, there's a few ideas behind this, but one that stands out to me is that keeping the law, even in the ancient Israelite world, it was something, and this reading Moses saying Jesus talked about this, the law itself pointed out the fact that it was never going to be kept.
It's impossible.
It was impossible. And Paul is going to go into this in Romans. He's going to talk about how impossible it is. And I think that just has to be said. Like, this is impossible. And it sort of leaves us in that place of hopelessness of like, well, even Leviticus isn't going to do what it was supposed to do. It's not even going to be the thing that brings us into the presence of God. I don't want to get there yet, though. Right now, I want us to see Leviticus as the thing. I want to sort of set reality off to the side and say Leviticus is the means by which God made for humanity to be restored into fellowship with Him. Because what Jesus does is more meaningful when we understand Leviticus that way. Okay? Number 2, the second one is, do you know? Grain offering. All right, let's read the grain offering. Leviticus chapter 2. If anyone brings a grain offering as an offering to Yahweh, his offering shall be of fine flour. He shall pour oil on it, and put frankincense on it, and bring it to Aaron's sons the priests, and he shall take from it a handful of fine flour and oil, with all of its frankincense, and the priest shall burn this as a memorial portion on the altar, a food offering with a noach ruach to Yahweh. So, of the grain offering, how much is offered and burned to Yahweh? One handful. So whether someone brings in one handful or whether they bring in 1,000 pounds, the priest takes one handful and throws it on the altar. What's done with the rest of it? Verse 3, but the rest of the grain offering shall be for Aaron and his sons. It is a most holy part of Yahweh's food offerings. So everyone in Israel has farms and cows and sheep and goats, and they're growing food because that's how they get food. There were no supermarkets. But the Levites, because of a number of people in Israel, are all day, every day working in the tabernacle, killing animals, but also the people who bring them kill them, but sacrificing animals and putting oil in the lampstand and replacing the table of showbread. They don't have time to go out and farm and get their own food. And so this grain offering and some other offerings that we're going to talk about as we go through, this is how the priests got their food. And that's a grain offering of just the loose grain. When you bring a grain offering baked in the oven, so now you've already turned it into bread. You bring it, it shall be unleavened loaves of fine flour mixed with oil, or unleavened wafer smeared with oil. And if your offering is a grain offering baked on a griddle, it shall be of fine flour mixed with oil. You shall break it in pieces and pour oil on it. It is a grain offering. If your offering is a grain offering cooked in a pan, it shall be made with fine flour with oil. And you shall bring the grain offering that's made of these things to Yahweh. And when it is presented to the priest, he shall bring it to the altar, and the priest shall take from the grain offering its memorial portion and burn this on the altar, a food offering with a pleasing aroma, a noach ruach to Yahweh. But the rest of the grain offering shall be for Aaron and his sons. It is the most holy part of the Lord's food offerings. Okay? The next section, if you bring an offering made with leaven, what do? You don't take it back, but you don't burn it. It can't be burned because no leaven or no honey can be burned as a food offering to the Lord. But as an offering of first fruits, you may bring them to Yahweh, but they shall not be offered on the altar for a noach ruach. You shall season all your grain offerings with salt. You shall not let the salt of the covenant with your God be missing from your grain offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt. Well, that's weird, right?
Yeah.
Okay. What just happened here, I think, is salt became maybe not as common as others, but just became a theme. Where's our themes? Here we go. So if we go down here, I opened that in the wrong thing. Sorry, I'm getting there. Open with. There we are. Okay, so if we go down here, we're running out of room. We're going to have to start a new one soon. Salt. Now, based on the passage we just read, when I see salt, I'm not going to use the word represents, but what do I think that salt will be a reminder of when it comes up in the Bible?
Covenant.
The covenant. So, covenant. So the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, right? What's that mean then? If salt is the representation of the covenant, then for you, Christian, to be the salt of the earth, you are the living, breathing example of the covenant to everyone around you. And if salt loses its flavor, it's useless. So if you, as a Christian, fail to be the living, breathing example of the covenant, you are useless. Ta-da! Auburn asked a very great question of me last week. I'm going to summarize it. Are themes the same every time you see them? Are numbers the same every time you see them? When is a 7 just a 7? And when is wine just wine? Right? So, okay, where have we seen salt before?
Pillar of salt with Lot's wife.
Lot's wife. She was turned into a pillar of salt. Does that represent the covenant? I mean, I could really stretch and make something up, but I really think that is kind of one of those places where I'm like, I don't know if the theme holds in that case. And so it takes that, even when you get themes, you can't just turn your brain off. This is kind of like how I was thinking about it this week, is you can't turn your brain off. You can't say, well, this represents this every time I see it. It was my problem with leaven all along. Beware the leaven of the Pharisees. But the kingdom of God is like leaven. So it can't be the same thing in both situations, right? Or at least it can't represent sin in both situations. And so I think this is one of those things where you just have to keep your brain turned on when you're studying the Bible. Okay? Everyone cool with that? All right, awesome. If you offer a grain offering of first fruits to Yahweh, you shall offer for the grain offering of your first fruits fresh ears, roasted with fire, crushed new grain, and you shall put oil on it, and lay frankincense on it. It is a grain offering, and the priest shall burn as its memorial portion some of the crushed grains and some of the oil with all its frankincense. It is a food offering to Yahweh. And this last one didn't say that the priests get to eat the rest of it, but the fact that they're only burning a memorial portion tells me there's more left over. And if you read the same exegetical constancy, it's sort of implied that this is also the priest's food. So that's the grain offering. Why do you make a grain offering? To say thank you. I agree with that for sure. But it's not explicit here. It was explicit with the burnt offering that you need acceptance and you need atonement, so you make a burnt offering. With the grain offering, it just says, if you make it, if you offer it, whatever, right? But there's this word that I don't know if you caught, but it appears a few times in this passage. I'm going to do a quick search for it, if I can spell it right. That way it highlights it. But do you notice there that it's actually mentioned 3 times in the end of this chapter? First fruits, first fruits, first fruits. It seems to me that we could take this grain offering and bring it into our understanding of what a tithe is. Now, it's not specific how much you're supposed to bring. It doesn't say you need to bring a tenth, and so I don't want to just say this is the tithe, because that's not the case. But it seems like we could associate this with the Feast of First Fruits, which we're going to study in Leviticus chapter 23. And when you harvest, that first fruits of what you harvest, the best of the crop, the first of the crop, it's not for you, it's not for your family, it's for the Lord. Does that make sense? Yeah. So why would you make a grain offering? Probably at harvest time, to say thank you, as you said, for the abundance of the harvest that you got. Okay?
So I also heard a commentary at one point that said it was a show of your trust.
Oh,
in
yeah.
that you were trusting God to continue to give you additional
to continue
fruits,
to provide,
if
yeah.
you will.
Mm-hmm.
So you gave him the first of it under the assumption that he's going to continue to provide.
Yeah, totally. Totally, yeah. Same idea with first fruits as it is with Sabbath. Why would you stop working to show that you trust God, that you're not your provider, but He is? Yeah, same type of deal. So the grain offering, what does it accomplish? It doesn't really accomplish atonement like the burnt offering did. Maybe you could argue it accomplishes saying thank you. But I'm just going to leave that spot blank and go over here and say, when would you make it? You would make it for first fruits.
Could you also say, it was like what you said at the beginning of it, when you start talking about it, when they take care of the
priests.
priests?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
It's a way to provide for them. So.
It is definitely a way to provide for the priests. Yeah, I'll just throw that in here since I have a big blank spot. Provide for priests.
I think it's funny that they also mentioned honey and bread with leaven. Like, you can still bring that,
But it's not, you don't burn it.
but it's just a way to maybe switch it up for the priests.
Yeah. I thought those were really interesting. Leaven and honey are both things that ferment.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Just showing me that.
Oh.
She's like, look, leaven and honey both ferment.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't want to get too into this, but in Numbers chapter 5, we're going to talk about a Nazirite vow where it's not specific to anything that ferments. It says that a person who takes a Nazirite vow can't drink wine throughout the duration of their vow. When you fast forward to Samson, who was one of the judges in Israel before the kings came around, he breaks the Nazirite vow in every way possible, including eating honey out of the body of a lion and jumping over a wall to take a shortcut through a vineyard, which he wasn't supposed to do as a Nazirite. And then there's the whole haircutting thing, which is very confusing if you don't understand the Nazirite vow, right? People want to argue about where Samson's power came from. Well, it has nothing to do with that. It's about the vow. Anyways, I'm just getting ahead of myself. Okay, number 3 is
Peace offering.
peace offering. Okay, peace offering. Peace off.
Peace out.
Okay, if his offering is a sacrifice of peace offering, if he offers an animal from the herd, male or female, okay, so how's it different from the burnt offering already? It can be a female. The burnt offering was only male. The peace offering can be male or female. He shall offer it without blemish before Yahweh. He shall lay his hand on the head of the offering and kill it at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And Aaron's sons, the priests, shall throw the blood against the sides of the altar. From the sacrifice of the peace offering as a food offering to Yahweh, he shall offer the fat covering the entrails, and all the fat that's on the entrails, and the 2 kidneys with the fat on them at the loins, and the long lobe of the liver he shall remove with the kidneys. Then Aaron's sons shall burn it on the altar, it being all of those things. They burn that on the altar, on top of the burnt offering, which is on the wood on the fire. It is a food offering with a Noah Ruach to Yahweh. Okay. How much of the animal is left when you make a peace offering? Like all of the meat. Right? Because you're cutting off the fat, you're taking out the kidneys, you're taking out the liver and the loins, the stuff that you wouldn't want to eat anyways. You're throwing that on there to God. That's the pleasing aroma. And then all the meat is left. Now, what do you do with the meat? Well, chapter 3 doesn't say. We're going to talk about that in chapter 6 and 7 next week. But guys, it's great. Okay. If his offering is a sacrifice of peace offering to Yahweh, and it's an animal from the flock, male or female without blemish, if it's a lamb, he offers it before Yahweh. He lays his hand on the head. He kills it in front of the tent of meeting. They throw the blood against the sides of the altar. It's a food offering to Yahweh. It's fat. He removes the fat tail, cuts close to the backbone, the fat that covers the entrails, the fat that's on the entrails, the 2 kidneys, the long lobe of the liver. He shall remove with the kidneys, and the priest burn all that on the altar as a food offering to Yahweh. Same basic exact thing that we just read. Okay, moving on. If it's a goat, and he offers it to Yahweh, he lays his hand on its head and kills it in front of the tent of meeting, and the sons of Aaron throw his blood against the sides of the altar, and he shall offer it as a burnt offering and food offering with fat, covering the entrails and the fat that's on the entrails, and the 2 kidneys and the fat that's on them, and the long lobe of the liver he removes with the kidneys, and they burn that as a pleasing aroma, as a Noah Ruach. All the fat is Yahweh's. And this is the one thing where it changes up, and I think that this sentence is really a summary of everything that came before it, not just this paragraph. It shall be a statute for forever throughout your generations in all your dwelling places that you eat neither fat nor blood. Okay, so Genesis 9, you don't eat meat with the blood in it because the life is in the blood. Acts chapter 15, the Jerusalem Council. We're not going to put any requirements on Gentiles when they get saved. Only tell them not to eat meat that's been strangled. Don't eat meat with blood in it. But we're not going to put any requirements on them, but don't eat meat with blood in it. I'm like, why? But it's good. Like, I like my burgers medium. So, what's going on there? Well, there's a lot of cultural background to that. At this point in time right here, I just want to kind of ask, where have we seen this before? And I'm looking back to Genesis 9. I'm looking back to, right here we're studying the Mosaic covenant, but it's looking back to the Noahic covenant, right? So I kind of just wanted to point that out for you, how these covenants are all sort of, even in the conditionality of the Mosaic covenant and the unconditionality of the Noahic covenant. I think I might have said that wrong. The covenants are connected. That's what I'm trying to say. Are you following me? Okay. So what's the purpose of the peace offering? I don't know. Chapter 3 didn't tell us. Why would I make a peace offering? I have no idea. I actually do, but we're going to get there next week when we study chapter 6 and 7. Right now, what we have been given is that you do a peace offering. We don't know why you do. We don't know what it accomplishes. We don't know when you do. Okay, so throw the peace offering in the back of your mind And guys, thematically, I don't want to say it's the most important because of how the burnt offering is so just clearly a picture of Jesus. So I don't want to say the peace offering is like the most important, but it's like the most important. Okay? It is really, I said, put it in the back of your mind. Put it in the front of your mind. As you're reading chapters 6 and 7 of Leviticus this week, be thinking about the peace offering and what that's telling you, what that's getting at, and how that relates to the new covenant is amazing. Okay? Cool?
Is there any explanation about the fat? Why is the fat belongs to the Lord?
I don't have one off the top of my head, but
Just is.
they just didn't eat it.
Back in the day, that would be a really choice part of an animal.
Mm-hmm. It still is today.
And that special, that fat around there, like 150 years ago, the suet was what you put it in like Christmas pudding. It was really fancy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so giving the best part to Yahweh. When we get into next week about the peace offering, it becomes important that a part goes to Yahweh. I don't know why it's the fat part in particular, aside from it being the best, but it will become important that a part goes to Yahweh, but not every part, like the burnt offering. Number 4. Number 4 is the sin offering. All right. And Yahweh spoke to Moses. Okay, where's Yahweh? He's in the tabernacle. Where's Moses? He's outside of the tabernacle. Which way does the door face?
Face east.
It faces east. So that when you enter, you're going west, and when you exit, you're going east, like Lot towards Sodom, right? You're walking away from the presence of God. Okay. Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, if anyone sins unintentionally in any of Yahweh's commandments about things not to be done, and does any one of them, if it is an anointed priest who sins, thus bringing guilt on the people, he shall offer for the sin that he has committed a bull from the herd without blemish for Yahweh as a sin offering. And he brings the bull to the entrance of the tent of meeting. He lays his hand on the head of the bull and kills the bull before Yahweh. And the anointed priest shall take some of the blood of the bull and bring it into the tent of meeting. And the priest shall dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle part of the blood 7 times before Yahweh in front of the veil of the sanctuary. And the priest shall put some on the blood of the horns of the altar of fragrant incense before Yahweh that's in the tent of meeting. And all the rest of the blood he shall pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering that is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And all the fat of the bull of the sin offering he shall remove from it, the fat that covers the entrails, the fat that's on the entrails, and the 2 kidneys. We just read this before. Just as these are taken from the ox of the sacrifice of peace offerings. And the priest shall burn them on the altar of burnt offering, but the skin of the bull and its flesh with its head, its legs, its entrails, and its dung, all the rest of the bull he shall carry outside the camp to a clean place, to the ash heap, and shall burn it up on a fire of wood. On the ash heap it shall be burned up. So this is the first time we've come across this idea that outside of the camp of Israel there is a heap of ashes. Now, why would there be a heap of ashes? Because they're constantly sacrificing things. The fire is always going, so they're going to be pulling ashes out. And remember, from Exodus, they made the fire pans and all the things for tending the fire and the pots and all that stuff. That's to empty the ashes out from the bottom of the altar and take it outside the camp to a clean place. But in this clean place, that's where they dump the carcass, minus the fat that was burned on the altar, of this bull for the sin offering. So, what is the purpose of a sin offering?
When you sin unintentionally.
Unintentional sin. Unintentional sin.
Question,
Yes.
before we go too far. In the peace offering, I don't see what they do with the carcass.
Right. We didn't get there yet.
All right.
They burn the fat,
Yeah.
and it didn't tell us what it does with the rest of the
Right.
animal. Yeah.
Okay.
It will in chapters 6 and 7. We're going to cover that next week. So, for a sin offering, unintentional sin, verses 3 through 12, if the priest sins unintentionally. Verses 13 through 21 is if the congregation sins unintentionally. And they do the same thing. They bring the blood inside the holy place. They sprinkle it 7 times in front of the the veil of the holy place, and then they put some on the horns of the altar of incense, and then they bring the rest outside and they dump it on the altar of burnt offering. Verses 22 through 26. If a leader sins unintentionally, or the sin which he's committed is made known to him, he brings his offering a goat without blemish, and he lays his hand on the head, and they kill it in the place where they kill the burnt offering before Yahweh. It's a sin offering. Then the priest shall take some of the blood and put his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering. Okay, so with the priests and the congregation, the blood went into the holy place. But with the leaders, and in verses 27 through 31, the common people, the blood does not enter the holy place. It stays in the courtyard. What just happened? My computer did not do what I thought it would do. Okay, let's try this. Untype. Well, that doesn't want to open. Okay, we're going to draw a new tabernacle here in a minute, but that doesn't open. Okay, are you with me though? You can picture in your mind. You're seeing the picture of the tabernacle with the priests and the congregation. The blood goes into the holy place. It's sprinkled in front of the veil where the cherubim are. It's like going all the way to the gate of Eden, where with everyone else is being right there at the altar for the burnt offering.
Okay. It says here, if the priest sin unintentionally, so who brings the sacrifice? Because they don't have animals. Because, I mean, all they have is what is left. So who atones for the priest?
Well, it's actually interesting. They may not have animals yet at this point in the story, but as the story goes on, and in Joshua, when the land is given to the nations, there's actually going to be 6 cities, 3 on the east side of the Jordan and 3 on the west side of the Jordan, that are set aside for the Levites who aren't actively working in the tabernacle. So I suppose that at some point in history they probably would have animals, because as the other tribes of Israel grow, so does the tribe of Levi. The tabernacle is 60 feet by 30 feet. Yeah. All of the Levites aren't working at once, right? So when we get into Chronicles and how David divides the roles of the priesthood, he does it into 24 parts, and each part serves for 2 weeks. So you come in, you do your 2-week shift, and you have the rest of the year off. And other people come in and do their 2-week shift. There's 24 divisions of the priesthood. Okay, real quick, side note, 24 divisions of the priesthood in the tabernacle. Why did they have to build the tabernacle to the dimensions that were given to Moses on Mount Sinai so specifically? It's because it's the earthly representation of the heavenly dwelling place of God. Are you with me? And there's 24 divisions of people who serve God in the tabernacle. So when John sees the heavenly dwelling place of God in Revelation, how many people do you think he's going to see serving God? 24. Okay. Yep, that's all I'm going to say on that.
I have a question.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Is it on that?
No.
Okay, great. Yeah, what is it?
Oh, well, my version on verse 22 says, when a ruler has sinned.
Uh-huh.
So it was if, and then when.
Sure.
Okay, that's it?
Yeah. They're all going to. I mean, you could say when for any of them.
Oh, okay. I just wondered if it was different because of if and then when.
Is it a different Hebrew word here?
I don't know.
When a share, which I wouldn't, it's a different Hebrew word, but I wouldn't apply, I don't think there's a theologically significant difference in meaning.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
That was my question.
Who was president when that version was printed?
You're mean.
Okay, if he brings a lamb as his offering for a sin offering, He shall bring a female without blemish and lay his hand on the head of the sin offering and kill it for a sin offering in the place where they kill the burnt offering. Then the priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering and pour out all the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. All its fat he shall remove, as the fat of the lamb is removed from the sacrifice of peace offerings, and the priest shall burn it on the altar on top of Yahweh's food offerings, and the priest shall make atonement for him for the sin which he has committed, and he shall be forgiven. So are you getting the picture that the burnt offering is on the bottom, and then there's the peace offering, and the fat of the peace offering goes on top of the food offering from before, and then there's the sin offering, and they take the fat and they put it on top of, what did it say, on top of the Lord's food offerings. Are you getting the picture that there's a giant pile of meat at the entrance of the tabernacle? Because that's the picture you should be getting here. There's a giant pile of animals, and on top of those animals is a giant pile of fat. And that's what's sitting on top of the altar. Okay, so just so you have your mental image right, this place was gross.
Yeah.
All right. If anyone sins in that he hears a public adjuration to testify, and though he is a witness, whether he has seen or come to know the matter, yet does not speak, he shall bear his iniquity. Or if anyone touches an unclean thing, whether a carcass of an unclean wild animal, or a carcass of unclean livestock, or a carcass of unclean swarming things, and it is hidden from him, and he has become unclean, and he realizes his guilt, or if he touches human uncleanness, or whatever sort of uncleanness may be with which one becomes unclean, and it is hidden from him, and when he comes to know it and realizes his guilt, or if anyone utters with his lips a rash oath to do evil or to do good, or any sort of rash oath that people swear, and it is hidden from him, when he comes to know it and he realizes his guilt in any of these, when he realizes his guilt in any of these and confesses the sin he has committed, he shall bring to Yahweh as his compensation for the sin that he has committed a female from the flock, a lamb or a goat for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for him for his sin. So what's the purpose of the sin offering? We read it in the last chapter and again now. Gosh.
Unintentional sin.
Boy, this thing is just broken right now. I don't know what happened. Is that going to open? Man, that is not going to open. I don't know what happened to that app, but we're going to have to go without it for the moment. Yeah, our list. So on your list, number 4, you have the sin offering. It was for unintentional sin, but what's accomplished is atonement, just like the burnt offering. The burnt offering, though, wasn't for unintentional sin. This wasn't clear when we were in chapter 1, but it's going to be made clear again next week in chapter 6 and 7, that burnt offering is for someone who basically commits intentional sin, where the sin offering is for someone who commits unintentional sin. And part of that unintentional sin is failing to give testimony if someone is on trial and you are aware of what they've done or haven't done. Touching an unclean thing, well, that makes you unclean or impure. You remember from the video we watched at the beginning. So that's not really sin. But what would be sin is not realizing you're unclean or impure and going to worship God at the tabernacle and bringing that uncleanness into the tabernacle. Well, now, not only are you unclean, but in your uncleanness, you have sinned by bringing it before God, and you have to make the sin offering to atone for bringing uncleanness into the tabernacle. Or if anyone swears a rash oath. Anyone remember Jephthah's vow? I'm going to go to war, and if God gives me victory, then whatever comes out of my house first, I'm going to offer to him as a sacrifice. And he gets back from war after he has victory, and his daughter runs out of the house, and he's lamenting and mourning because now he has to kill his daughter. Okay, so what should Jephthah, how could that story have gone better?
Don't make that promise.
If he hadn't made a rash vow in
Yes.
the first place, or if he had realized he'd made a rash vow and atoned for it with a sin offering. Okay, he didn't do either of those things and murdered his daughter. So
Isn't that like a point where they sort of forgot a lot of what the Torah said?
I mean, it's like right smack dab in the middle of Judges, which everyone does what's right in their own eyes. So that's exactly what's going on, yeah.
John?
Yes,
so
sir.
What's the difference between the congregation and the common people?
I think the congregation is a singular unit, and the common people would be like if a person does it. So if the whole congregation, and I think that this is an important distinction later on when like Josiah is renovating the temple and finds a copy of the law, and he reads it and goes like, we have all screwed this up like really, really bad. We all have to go and do this thing. The whole congregation did it. Versus the common people is like, if Joe, what's the Hebrew name, goes in and does something wrong, then he has to do the sin offering. I think that's the distinction that's going on there. And I think that's why with the congregation, the blood goes into the holy place, but with the common people, it doesn't. It's sort of the national identity versus the individual identity.
And is there any significance to the common people having a female sacrifice?
I think
instead of the rest are all male.
Yeah, I think the same difference as the burnt offering is male and the peace offering is male or female. I think that there is a level of significance to the offerings in how they represent Jesus. The burnt offering has to represent Jesus, so it has to be male. Whereas the peace offering, we'll talk about this next week, represents something else. And the sacrifice for the common people is a little bit, if you will, like less important. Like the people aren't as important, right? They're just as Joe versus David, right? So I think it's just that level of importance and representation of Jesus.
Okay.
Yeah, does that make sense?
Yep.
Cool.
And also chiastic though, too.
Excellent.
Well, so the peace offerings is in the middle, right?
Yeah.
But, well, so the ones for atonement are on the ends.
Yeah.
And then the grain offering and the
Grain
offering and the sin offering.
and the guilt offering is the last one. Surrounding the peace offering.
Yeah, that's there.
So that would put the peace offering at the center of the chiasm.
Yeah. Well, so that's what restoration would be, right? So the peace offering, peace with the Lord.
Yeah.
I didn't get to 6 and 7 yet, so I don't know.
Yeah, no, you're totally on track and you don't even know how on track you are. That is so cool.
Good job, Jacob.
So I had a thought about the common person versus the leader.
Yeah.
Is a leader actually leads other people, and so when he sins, it's far worse than a common person who most people don't even notice when they sin.
Yeah, totally. We're talking about David, like King
Yeah.
David, right? Versus Uriah. I don't know.
Yeah. Some unknown person.
Yeah. Or someone even less known than Uriah, right?
Yeah.
Great. More on the sin offering? Everyone ready? Verse 7. If he can't afford a lamb, he shall bring to Yahweh as his compensation for the sin that he has committed 2 turtle doves. So like the song, right? And a partridge in a pear tree. Okay, so like you're laughing, but check this out. That song is biblical. The partridge in a pear tree, and it gets harder to like line things up as you get further into the song because it's that's work of fiction, right? Dancing with like 12 drummers, like that's not in the Bible, but you have a sacrifice of a bird on a tree, right? And 2 turtle doves. That's the sacrifice that a person makes if they can't afford to make another sacrifice. It's this, by the way, 2 turtle doves is what Mary and Joseph offer at the temple in Luke chapter 2. Because Jesus, who comes from the line of David, who should have been king, was so poor that his family couldn't afford to make the sacrifice for him. They had to sacrifice 2 turtle doves. That's a pretty cool song. Okay, he wrings its head from its neck. He doesn't sever it completely. He sprinkles out the blood of the sin offering on the side of the altar. Will the rest of the blood shall be drained out at the base of the altar as a sin offering that he shall offer, bless you. Then he shall offer the second for a burnt offering according to the rule, and the priest shall make atonement for him for the sin he has committed, and he shall be forgiven. If he cannot afford 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, he shall bring as his offering for the sin he has committed 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour, and it goes on to describe that. What's happening in these passages?
God's making provision for everyone.
That's what I think is going on here. God is making provision so that the sin offering is available to the poorest of the poor in Israel. There's nobody based on economic status who God wants to be excluded from being able to receive atonement for unintentional sins. Does that make sense? All right. Now, halfway through chapter 5, because people don't know how to make chapter breaks. By the way, you know that chapter breaks are not inspired in the original text, and verse numbers are not inspired in the original text. Okay, so when you hear someone talk about like John 6:66 and how meaningful it is that the people stop following Jesus at John 6:66, they turn and they stop following him. Like, okay, that's a great mnemonic device to remember the verse, but don't associate it with Revelation 19 because the chapter and verse numbers are not inspired. Okay? We're actually not, you might have stopped reading at 5, but this section doesn't stop at the end of 5. It goes to chapter 6, verse 7, so we're going to go all the way through chapter 6, verse 7 tonight. It says this, Yahweh spoke to Moses saying, if anyone commits a breach of faith and sins unintentionally in any of the holy things of Yahweh. Now, what are the holy things that we've been reading about for the last hour? The sacrifices. Yeah. If someone messes up a sacrifice, if you accidentally burn the wrong part and eat the wrong part, or if the priest make the bread and forget to throw some on the altar, if anyone sins by messing up a sacrifice, he shall bring to Yahweh as his compensation a ram without blemish out of the flock, valued in silver shekels, according to the shekel of the sanctuary, for a guilt offering. So does he bring a ram, or does he bring money? He brings the value of a ram. So if you mess up a sacrifice, you don't bring another sacrifice, because odds are you're going to mess that one up too. Instead, you just bring the value of the thing that was messed up in the first place. Does that make sense? Okay, so you bring the money, the silver, shekel of sanctuary for a guilt offering. He shall also make restitution for what he has done amiss in the holy thing, and shall add a fifth to it, and give it to the priest. So he messed up. He did the thing wrong. Whose job does that affect? That affects the priest's job. If the guy messes up in bringing his offering, then the priest messes up in making the offering, right? So you make restitution for the thing you messed up by bringing the value to the sanctuary, and then you make amends with the priest by adding a fifth to it, and the priest gets to keep that. And he shall be forgiven. If anyone sins, doing any of the things that the Lord that by the Lord's commandments ought not to be done, though he did not know it, then realizes his guilt, he shall bear his iniquity, he shall bring to the priest a ram without blemish. This is just summarizing or giving us the guilt offering. The priest shall make atonement for him for the mistake that he made unintentionally, and he shall be forgiven. Isn't that the same as the sin offering? If you do something unintentionally that God said don't do, you do a sin offering, but you also do a guilt offering. So this is number 5, by the way. I'm sorry, my thing didn't work. It stopped working. But if you're making your list, guilt offering should be number 5. And you do a guilt offering when you sin unintentionally. It's the same as the sin offering. So I think, people are doing 2 offerings at the same time when they sin unintentionally. One for sin and one for guilt. So one to bring atonement and one to bring a clean conscience.
So is the guilt offering not restricted to mistakes made within the sacrificial system as opposed to in daily life?
So it is, if you make mistakes in the sacrificial system, you make a guilt offering for it. If you sin unintentionally in daily life, you make a sin offering and a guilt offering, is what I think is happening here. Then, starting in chapter 6, Yahweh spoke to Moses saying, if anyone sins and commits a breach of faith against Yahweh by deceiving his neighbor in a matter of deposit or security, or through robbery, or has oppressed his neighbor, this is not unintentional, right? This is, you have something I want, and I'm going to take it. And if an Israelite does that, or he has found something lost and lied about it, swearing falsely, in any of all the things that people do and sin thereby, like, okay, so it's saying, everyone does this. If he has sinned and has realized his guilt and will restore what he took by robbery, or what he got by oppression, or the deposit that was committed to him, or the lost thing that he found, or anything about which he has sworn falsely, he shall restore it in full, and shall add a fifth to it, and give it to him whom it belongs, on the day he realizes his guilt, and he shall bring to the priest as his compensation to Yahweh a ram without blemish out of the flock or its equivalent for a guilt offering, and the priest shall make atonement for him before Yahweh, and he shall be forgiven for any of the things that one may do and thereby become guilty. So in Leviticus chapters 1 through 5, there are 5 offerings. You have the burnt offering, which is for atonement for sin. You have the grain offering, which you make it first fruits when you offer to God out of the fullness of the harvest. You have the peace offering, which we're going to talk more about next week. We have the what we know about it is that only the fat is burned, and there's a whole bunch of meat left, and that has to go somewhere. That's what we're going to talk about. Then you have the sin offering. That's for when someone sins unintentionally, whether it's the priest, whether it's the congregation, whether it's a leader of the people, or whether it's a common person. Then you have the guilt offering, and the guilt offering covers you if you mess up any of the other offerings. It covers you if you sin unintentionally, just like the sin offering, or it covers you if you sin intentionally against your neighbor through theft or by lying or any number of those things by which a person sins. So those are the 5 offerings of Leviticus.
So, New King James Version, it calls the guilt offering a trespass offering?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's the idea of like you have trespassed against your neighbor, whereas all the others are more of a trespass against God.
So that's how you would choose if you did a burnt offering versus the guilt,
A guilt offering, I think so. Yeah, I think so.
I have a question about, in Exodus, it mentions a wave offering and a heave offering.
Yeah, and Leviticus doesn't talk about those.
Yeah.
It also mentions a drink offering.
Yeah,
We
I
haven't
have
talked
that
about
too.
that
Yeah.
either. So there are more offerings than just these 5.
Okay.
Yeah, but these 5 are the ones that God told Israel to do, or told Moses to tell Israel to do at the tabernacle here in Exodus. I mean, here in Leviticus.
Okay.
But these are not all the offerings. There is also an offering for when you're cured of leprosy. There's also the Numbers 19 red heifer offering for purification. And then there's also the Day of Atonement, where you offer the 2 goats. One goes into the wilderness and one is killed. And so there are a number of offerings that we're going to continue talking about throughout the Torah that are not here. I think that these 5 are foundational because they tell us about, think of the structure of Leviticus, right? These 5 tell us about the ritual offerings that were required and are the thing that are going to bring Israel into the presence of God and accomplish the purpose of the tabernacle. The other offerings that come up are in their own way going to participate in doing that, but are not the main 5.
Can we talk about the scapegoat, or is that to come?
I don't want to talk about the scapegoat right now.
Okay.
Here's what I'll say.
Later?
Oh, we're going to talk about the scapegoat. You better believe it. But it's in Leviticus 16. I'll give you a taste. Okay? The word scapegoat is a translation used in the NKJV. The Hebrew word for scapegoat is azazel, which does not mean scapegoat.
Oh,
Okay? So, huh?
Isn't that one of the fallen angels?
So, I think so. So there's a little taste for you. Okay. It's weird. It's weird. And why do, and okay. Yep, all right. Get me off track here. That Day of Atonement is not part of these 5 offerings. The Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16, what all of these 3 sections are leading up to, and the following 3 sections are leading away from, as you look at Leviticus chiastically, it is its own thing that only happens one day a year, where these 5 are happening all the time, with the exception of the grain offering that's happening at first fruits. Yeah. Want to watch another video? Hit it, Fred.
If you start reading the Bible from the beginning, you'll get about halfway through the 2nd book, Exodus, and you'll come to a bunch of ancient laws.
Thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that.
Now these laws are all written in the literary style we call prose discourse. And they're found all over the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th books of the Bible. There's over 600 laws.
And since reading ancient law code isn't something your friends do a lot, odds are you're going to struggle. So, let's talk about how to read the law in the Bible.
So the first thing to remember is that the Bible is not a behavior manual with a complete list of what to do and not to do to make God happy.
Right, the Bible is an epic narrative. But in the story, God does tell people what to do.
For sure. The story begins with God's plan to rule the world through humans who will trust him and live by his wisdom. And here we find the first divine command in the Bible.
Don't eat from the tree of knowing good and evil, because the day you do, you'll die.
But the humans take the authority to know and define good and evil for themselves, and it's not good. It leads to a world of violence and death, and they're exiled from the garden.
Okay, so this was the first law in the Bible?
Well, it's the first divine command, and it invites people to trust God and live by his wisdom. And so while it's not part of the laws given to Israel, it does foreshadow them, because those too are invitations to trust God's wisdom.
So when do the laws of Israel come?
Okay, here's the story. Israel is enslaved in Egypt, so God saves them and then invites them into a covenant relationship, like a marriage. And the laws make up the terms of that covenant.
And so do we get a catalog of all these laws that God gave Israel?
Actually, no, we don't get all of the laws, only examples. And these have been strategically placed in between stories about how Israel keeps violating the laws.
So I'm supposed to see that Israel's no different than the humans in the garden. They don't trust God or live by his wisdom.
Right, and so it leads to another round of tragedy, violence, and death.
And it ends in exile.
And so while the laws are good and show God's wisdom, they also expose Israel's inability to be God's faithful partners.
I'm following. But when I read the laws, I find a lot of strange stuff. Like not allowing clothing to be made of 2 different fabrics. Like how does that show God's wisdom?
Okay, so it's important to realize that many of these laws are ancient ritual symbols that set Israel apart, that is, made them holy. So some laws made Israel distinct from neighboring nations, while other laws kept them away from things that in their culture symbolized death, disease, and moral corruption.
Okay, but what about all of the ritual killing of animals?
Sacrifices were also ritual symbols that connected people to God. Since you, a mortal, can't ascend up to God's presence in the heavenly temple, a blameless animal that was offered could go up in your place, covering for your failures so you can know you're accepted by God.
I see. But not all of the laws are ancient rituals. Some of them are just about being a good person and treating others well.
Well, yes, but these laws aren't just about being good. They're about justice, which is a big deal to God. On the first page of the Bible, we learn that every human is made in God's image and is worthy of dignity. And these laws apply that ideal in Israel's day. In fact, these laws still underlie many of the concepts of justice and equality that we take for granted today.
But some of the laws don't seem just, like laws that allow for slavery.
Well, if you look at those laws in their ancient cultural context, you'll see that God's working with Israel as he finds them, pushing them towards justice. So slavery isn't abolished, but it is undermined. For example, Israel was supposed to reenact the Exodus liberation by releasing slaves and forgiving all debts every 7 years. This was revolutionary in the ancient world.
All right. Now what about all the laws about Sabbath rest on the 7th day and all the 7-day feasts? I mean, what's up with all of these sets?
Yeah, so these laws about sacred time are all connected to the first creation narrative in Genesis. God brings order out of chaos in 6 days that each have a clear beginning and end. But when you get to the 7th day, it has no end. That's because it's pointing to the idea of humans partnering with God in his rule and rest. All of these 7-day feasts are rituals that symbolize humanity's true purpose and future hope.
Okay, so all of these laws given to Israel can fit into those basic categories.
Yes, and each category expresses a core ideal of God's wisdom. And the laws show how those ideals should be applied in the culture of ancient Israel.
But as the story makes clear, Israel failed at fulfilling the law over and over. How is God going to get humans to trust his wisdom?
Well, Moses and the prophets after him trusted that one day God would transform the human heart, so people can be faithful covenant partners who trust his wisdom. And that brings us to the story of Jesus.
Yeah, Jesus said he came to fulfill the law.
Right. He was the faithful covenant partner that Israel and all humanity was made to be, but has failed to be. Jesus lived by the divine ideals underlying the laws, and he taught that the laws are all fulfilled when you love God and love your neighbor as yourself.
And Jesus promised that God's Spirit would come and transform his followers so they too could live this way.
And so, when followers of Jesus read these laws today, we need to remember they were given to Israel in their ancient cultural setting. You couldn't follow many of them even if you tried.
But what you can do is see God's wisdom in the laws.
Right, and trust that God's Spirit can guide you to follow that wisdom as you learn to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself.
I love that one. No? Okay. All right, so I want to end tonight in Psalm 24, verse 3. And it says this: Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? Okay, so here's the title of our book that we're reading together. And who shall stand in his holy place? So remember, they were at Sinai in Exodus. Only Moses could go up. The 70 could go halfway up. Israel was stuck at the bottom. The nations were outside. It was the 4 levels of Eden all over again. Who is it? What Psalm 24 is saying here, when you compare that, is who is it who can go into the midst of the garden? Who can go back and who can return to that place? Or if you look forward from the garden and forward from Sinai into the tabernacle, who is it that can go into the most holy place? And who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false and does not swear deceitfully, he will receive a blessing from Yahweh and righteousness from the God of his salvation. Such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek the face of Jacob. In Hebrew, it doesn't say the God of Jacob, it says who seek the face of Jacob. That is we talked about that in Exodus, the pointing to God by reminding us of the covenant that he made with the patriarchs. So who can ascend the hill of the Lord? Who can enter into God's holy of holies? Who can return back to the midst of the Garden of Eden? And check this out. This word right here, ascend. What did I say was ascend earlier tonight? The burnt offering, olah. Who can olah into God's presence? And it's that burnt offering of Leviticus chapter 1 that olahs with a noach ruach, a spirit that appeases the wrath of God, that puts God at rest, that substitutionarily atones by me putting to death an innocent thing for my own sin. That's the person who can ascend the mountain of the Lord, or the hill of the Lord. I think that's so cool. It's tying, what Psalms is doing is it's giving us that sort of exposition on the tabernacle, talking about the olah and God's holy place, and it's telling us that we can't accomplish what the tabernacle was meant to accomplish unless we have clean hands and a pure heart. We don't lift up our soul to what is false or swear deceitfully. And we don't do that, and Jesus does that. So Psalm 24 is looking back, and it's looking forward, and it gives us that hope of the future Messiah as we're sitting back here stuck in the Old Testament. So this week, it's a big week. It's a heavy week. I'm sorry for that. But you only have 2 chapters of Leviticus to read. Read Leviticus chapters 6 and 7, but you're going to read Morales, who shall ascend the mountain of the Lord, chapters 2 and 3. And it's a lot, and it's heavy, but there's a blessing in it. If you're willing to put in the time, if you're willing to turn on the TV an hour later, 2 nights this week, then there's a blessing in this for you. Morales chapters 2 and 3. What it's going to do in those 2 chapters, and the reason why I think it's so important that we do them together, is it's giving us the symbolism, and he's going to do it in much more detail and much more eloquently than I'm able to. He's going to give you the symbolism of Eden in the tabernacle and in the Leviticus story in chapters 2 and 3. So I'm really excited for that. I'm excited to get into it this week, and I hope that it's as big of a blessing for you as it has been for me. Anyone got any questions before we close up? All right. Dad, do you want to pray for us? Thanks.
Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time you've given us to come together to study your word, Lord, to open up the things that you've put down for us that we could see you more closely. Father, we thank you for John and his study and his bringing forward these ideas and concepts that sometimes we miss when we just read through your word, Lord. We ask for your blessing on this time. We ask for your blessing on those who weren't able to be here this evening. Father, we ask for your strength that we would be able to study on our own through this next week and come back prepared to meet you in a much more a deeper way. So be with us, Lord. Bless us. Keep us safe. We love you and we want to be with you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.